With thousands of plugs to cut, we went for a more efficient way to cut the plugs than the typical. Everything was run on material left over from the planking, and then those long strips were cut on the bandsaw with a simple guide that allows us to cut the same depth of plug each time without having to pop each individual one out one at a time. So I made a jig to cut all of the excess plug material for all the screws. It involves a small router, a router bit, and a set of guide rails that allows it to flush cut the exposed material right down to the planking surface very closely to minimize our longboarding and sanding.
Right now we're in the middle of the fairing process. And what I'm doing is I'm marking the section that I'm fairing with a pencil. And that way, as you're sanding with the longboard, it'll show what parts of the planking the longboard's actually hitting and what spots it's not. So these are the longboards that we're using for the project. This is a 30-inch flexible longboard, and this is a 30-inch stiff longboard. And the flexible one's just good for getting around, you know, contours and big turns like that.
What grit?
So I'm starting out with 60 grit, and then I'm gonna go up to 80 grit. And then after that, we'll switch over to a half sheet sander where we'll go up to 120 grit. Is that 30 or is it 36?
It is 30.
Yeah, you were right. You thought I didn't know my stuff?
The kid was right.
The nice thing about this project is that the owners of the boat care about the boat so much that they like us to do it and restore it in a traditional manner, whether it's using traditional tools, modern tools, but they want to keep that boat alive and floating for another 50 to 100 years.
We're using the same methods to restore the Barnegat that they used when they built the boat in 1962. Since we had to replace so many planks, we had to recreate the cove stripe. Cove stripes by nature are nearly full length of the boat, and the bow and the stern, they usually have an arrowhead at the bow and usually some sort of feather at the stern. We replicated that very closely to Barnegat's original. So when we opened up the Barnegat's deck, we realized there was a significant amount of underlying damage that we had to address. Wood decay damage on a boat typically comes from underwater on up. On this type of damage from the deck is essentially from water coming down from the top, leaking through holes, deck stanchions, and so forth. So now when we're putting it together with solid compressed fiberglass G10 plates. So that's set underneath, that's set on the top and into the deck. So the entire thing is extremely rigid and won't allow those fasteners to move anymore, and it'll be bonded well, so you won't have an issue with moisture coming down those fasteners and rotting it again.
Let the wood drop and throw the clamp to the side. Make sense?
Without scratching the paint and the lazarette.
All right, we ready to go?
So the back deck was made from 4 pieces of plywood, all scarfed together as one big piece. It was all made based on a pattern that was made beforehand. And once that was done, it was left slightly large, about an inch around on all edges. So then once it was bonded down for good, then it gets sealed and trimmed.
How you look?
I gotta go further forward.
Yeah, we're hitting. These clamps are hitting
I'm almost
now.
to
I
your
can see
line.
it.
I'm almost to your line. All right, so now we can hop up there. I guess we're set. Just a matter of putting screws in now.
All right, you got, yeah.
Everything below the mid-cabin trim was reglassed.
I got scissors right here.
Yep.
From the sides down to the deck and over the deck edge onto the planking edge.
So this is a caulking wheel just like Kyle's using on the other side. It's an antique one I got at a store. You just lay it in. And with these seams, because they're so narrow, we just can get away with just rolling them in. And then we come back with what we call a making iron, which is just it's flat piece of metal wedged. And you're just sending it home into the seam. This is a caulking mallet, traditional caulking mallet. They're made out of mesquite. And this is just what they've always used. Your irons are metal, so you need a hardwood on your hammer. You don't want to use a metal hammer because that'll give you too much force. This way you can actually gauge how much force that you're hitting it with. I learned traditional caulking about 20 years ago at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum from a master shipwright. So sometimes by the butts of the planks and where the frames are, where you can tell by the bungs, you have to hit it a little harder because there's more resistance because there's a frame right there or a butt block right there. So to get it to set, sometimes you just got to put a little more pressure on it. You can actually see. So you see how this cotton's out on the edge out a bit? So what we're doing is just sending it home. You don't want to hit your cotton in too deep or overstuff the seam because once the planks swell, they could have a tendency to buckle or blow out. You know, like this whole seam, you know, if it's too much pressure. So you got to find that nice kind of sweet spot where you're just hitting enough to set it without putting too much pressure on the wood or the seams. When it comes to the traditional methods, they're pretty tried and true because they've been doing them for hundreds of years. It's also a great way to carry on that tradition, teach it to other people because not a lot of people are into this industry as much as they used to be. So it's nice to pass on the skills, and it also gives you it gives you a sense of place.